One of the biggest concerns of early cloud seeding, weather control activities by the General Electric Corporation, came from their lawyers who thought that the corporation was totally vulnerable to lawsuits because if they started to make fair or foul weather, the people down below in Massachusetts or downwind of Schenectady could institute massive lawsuits that could put GE out of business. So the first response to weather control from their in-house lawyers was to shut it down, was to give the project to the military and ask them to do it, with the GE lawyers only being the consultants on the project. So they were allowed to suggest and design certain activities, but they weren't allowed to touch anything or throw anything out of the plane.
The United States government during the Vietnam War perfected weather modification techniques, and also they perfected releasing toxic chemicals like Agent Orange over many areas to defoliate land, trees, grasslands, and other areas.
But this is technology that does come up, and it comes up when you see that the technology advanced far enough to where the practicality of utilizing it in the battlefield environment and the temptation by administrations. I mean, the best covert war is using the environment itself against your adversary.
It was a military moment, and it was actually from pretty recent history. And this was the U.S. military thinking that they might be able to control the monsoon over Vietnam during that conflict. And so only a handful of top-level military advisors and the president were informed that they were going to try to make it rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and try to have some military advantage by doing this kind of intervention.
When you start talking about manipulating the environment, we have treaties that go back to the mid-70s that forbid this, number one, as weapons of war.
So the perfection of weather modification took place, but it became apparent that using weather modification for wartime purposes was not acceptable to the United States government and other nations of the world. So therefore, the NMOD Treaty came into being and was signed by the United States government after passing Congress. The reason it was signed and implemented was because it would ban warfare, weather modification techniques and use during times of war.
Almost all of our treaties that we've signed, including the non-proliferation, counter-proliferation treaties, chemical treaties, the ones that were signed recently, last few years, back maybe a decade now, I guess time goes. But they had domestic exemptions, and so does the environmental treaty, where you can do whatever you want in your own territorial boundaries. When you start manipulating weather in one part of the planet, it doesn't look on the ground and say, oh yeah, wait, this is the boundary of a political boundary. It fails to recognize those. So you start to talk about geophysics and manipulating the planet itself, then it's a question of those kinds of exemptions shouldn't even be allowed.
Meteorology and the military have a very long history, as I said, and it goes into the strategic advantage that multiplies your traditional force, that is your armament, into using nature to your advantage as well.
They want to create a storm in the southeast, then they'll start engineering out over the North Pacific. That's where the trailies will be, because you want to work out several days ahead of time so you have less input, and you multiply that over a couple of days, you can have a big result in 5 days' time. So small input upstream, big result downstream. And one of the rules is always work with what's coming. Don't try to necessarily work against it. You can kill a storm in place. That's easy to do with HAARP. You just change the polarization, you change the ionization of the atmosphere, and the storm will fall apart.
It will affect the setting up of the storm tracks, the jet stream, the location of the storms. And so you end up with an intervention on the solar side of things would pretty directly begin to affect the weather patterns. And so climate control, or attempted climate control, and weather control rely on this very large spectrum of intervention. It's also true that if you can forecast climate, you can control a lot of futures markets, and you could know if you had the best information or if you had some leverage over what the climate system is going to turn out to be, you would be able to invest in advance in all your crop futures and your agricultural activities, and not just agriculture, but weather effects. I think it's something like 80% of the U.S. economy is weather sensitive, and so all kinds of businesses would like to see some weather edge, some advantageous information that they would have.
It's absolutely entirely possible to profit from the weather.
My name is Michael Agney. I'm an independent trader. Trading commodities at the CME Group, member of the Chicago Board of Trade, and have traded derivatives and futures cash for over 15 years. Weather derivatives are financial instruments that firms would use to hedge risk concerned with adverse weather conditions. The first weather derivative was originally traded by Enron back in 1997. Weather derivatives started in 1999 at the CME Group. Big utilities, reinsurers to hedge against hurricanes or tornadoes or flooding, some sort of catastrophe, hedging against a cooler summer or a warmer winter. Let's just say I was insuring a product for $5 million, no matter what it was. Let's say if I was a utility company, a farmer, whatever it was. Let's say I had $5 million worth of crop, but I can do derivatives that are worth double that amount, and I can control the effects to where I collect on the insurance that's worth $10 million as opposed to selling the crop for $5 million. Yes, I could definitely profit from that. 2010, 2011, Southern Illinois, Missouri, those we had a high peak of tornadoes and those types of adverse weather conditions definitely raised the price of commodities as well as drove the volatility, which also raises the price of commodities. You're going to make more money if a crop fails. You're creating insurance that's over the price of what your crop is worth, let's say. So if you can control the weather, you control how these products grow. And if you had an insight to how these products were actually seeded and what products you use to actually grow those items, corn, soybeans, and you can control that market, it's unlimited profit potential if you can control the weather.
If you want to send, cold into the Midwest, you buy up pipeline capacity, you buy up options on heating and cooling degree days, you buy derivatives off of rainfall. There are mechanisms that you can make hundreds of billions of dollars annually and defray a huge chunk of the cost of this just on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, playing with derivatives in the weather market.
Weather derivatives are basically, you're betting that there's going to be a weather disaster, and you're betting that it's going to occur within a particular time frame in a particular location, and then, the money that you put up basically is like a bet. It's like a wager, saying that this incident's going to happen here, and then when it does happen, there's a big payoff. And that big payoff is something that motivates people to continue to participate in this kind of thing and maybe even feed the very process that's causing the bad weather to happen. Particularly if there's a connection between the people that are seeding the clouds and the people that are making investments.
This is a new opportunity. It's a new tool for investors. Even if someone has no interest in, going on the offensive side and buying things, it definitely behooves them to be aware of what's going on out there. The extreme weather is here, and it's not going to reverse itself. The weather event has to be severe.
Ionospheric heating, in fact, these instruments, when they were first utilized, which is in the former Soviet Union back in the 70s, they started out then, they still call these ionospheric heaters because in one mode of operation, you can literally create above this instrument on the ground, you can heat an area up to 30 miles in diameter in the ionosphere. So you heat it up, and by heating it, it literally raises it. So then imagine this column moving up several hundred kilometers out, and then the lower atmosphere begins to rush in and fill that vacant space, that void. And as a result, you're altering pressure systems for quite a distance, which of course alters the weather. You're also able, if a jet stream is coming in the air, you're able to alter its course. And if you alter a jet stream, even a small amount, then the swing factor on the other end, you can move it. So you're moving storms, say, out of the Midwest onto the East Coast, or this kind of thing, by just swinging it high in terms of its flow and getting it redirected.
Okay, so now if we look at precipitation, much has been made of this issue of damage from precipitation.
Which the particulates that these trails have introduced into the sky are, let's just say the storms can develop more violently, more quickly, in places that are not necessarily as where you would expect them to be. And so we see more flooding, we see more intense droughts. We see rainfall rates of 1 to 2¼ inches an hour that are just bizarre, and sometimes even rainfall, 1 inch and 1/4 a minute is just unheard of.
And so you have an area that's already been heated by the sun's rays, and then you have the aerosol drift in over that area, and it's reflecting both ways. It's reflecting the heat of the sun back out, but it's also trapping the heat that's already been created there by the sunlight. So it will actually create more heat and trap heat inside and closer to the atmosphere. It can actually exacerbate global warming problems.
And if you become more aware of what's happening, where the global commodities are, what extreme weather events, you're one step ahead of them.
The nature of the risk and our ability to respond to the risk is much greater in the case of the scenario that might involve large-scale regional agricultural disruption lasting a number of years.
So the agenda was drought. The agenda was to kill the storm, at least in that one particular spot.
You see a tremendous and significant loss of property and crop production. Many times this will cause farms to go out of business. And when farmers go out of business, they usually have to sell. And then if there's somebody waiting in the wings to buy their land and then turn that land over to the production of genetically modified crops, you can see where there would be kind of a strategic advantage there.
There's something that happened in the Midwest, and I'm sure everybody's heard about the flooding in the Midwest. And what happened is George Soros and his big corporate monolith went in and started buying up the farmland. So not only is it creating all these stresses, it appears to be a corporate land grab. In other words, when the farmers, the small farmers, go out of business, they're wiped out through these droughts and everything, then the big guys come in, buy up the land.
And if you think of Western history, there's a lot of it concerning water rights and even water wars. And so they were shooting about access to water to water your livestock. And now people are thinking, or at least the people who are involved in weather control sometimes think about the river of moisture above our heads, and geez, if we could just tap that. But that too is a water right that would involve access to people that felt that maybe they had prior rights over it.
You're reducing the food security of people through deploying these kinds of approaches that potentially 2 billion people could have their food disrupted by such interventions.